No. We are so happy that you are here in the museum, really, with this presentation of this. Is your third book about your dialogue that you began to have it in the COVID, no? I remember this. And it's only, I'm going to put a few words about, thank you, András, to be here in Calus Museum. You know the museum, you visited the exhibition of Velasco. Yeah. I hope that you like it.
Very much.
And this is really for us so important that you have the occasion to present this book in Calus, because it's the first time that you are going to present the book in the world. No, mm-hmm. This is this presentation that means for us really. When you began to tell me about this trip to Mexico, and when I told you about all the issues about AI, let me tell you that we began to be in Tamayo Museum with a splendid presentation that you gave to us, and was really, really amazing what were your thoughts about what is happening. And of course, you gave to us the opportunity to know that AI will have not only questions but answers, no? That you put really in this mirror that we for me was really splendid to hear you. But well, András is going to tell us this is our third book. The first book that you made was related about the software. Yeah. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about this. And the second one is the hardware, because the first one was really put it in a relation about directors, the second about the architects, and the third one was more open. Yeah. And I am going to tell you that András is a colleague that was in the research about what is happening in the cultural field, in museums, and also in the future. And for me, it was an opportunity in May of this year that, thank you for your invitation. I was with another colleagues, directors from all around the world, and it was really very important to know what happened in San Francisco and what happened in Silicon Valley. But thank you, András. Thank you to be here in Calus Museum. And I think that our friend wants to tell us a little bit, because you know him since 20 years ago, András. And Berta Sea is going to tell a little bit about András, please. And
I welcome. Just want to say a few words that I'm very happy that András is here. Thank you, Blanca. Thank you, Miguel, for bringing this wonderful man to Mexico. As you all know, I left the U.S. Embassy many years ago in 2013, but I'm still very much involved in things happening between the U.S. and Mexico. And I'm absolutely convinced that all these people that we have brought to Mexico along the years to talk about performing arts, visual arts, museum studies, etc., the person who had not come, and I think is very important, is András. So right. This is part of the important people that have come to Mexico to create a dialogue between institutions in Mexico and the US, like with Lucina, that we worked with Michael Kaiser, and we can mention many more. And definitely, these last books that he has written about museums and about the architecture, the future of museums, the architecture, museums, and this book that he's going to talk about today, the fact that he has interviewed all these people in the museum world, in all kinds of galleries and all kinds of institutions, I think creates a very useful dialogue. And definitely with the way that Mexico has advanced in arts management, now in so many universities and so many places, like the Instituto de Liderazgo de Museos, the UP, and many other universities, this is exactly what we all have to listen to. Thank you. Very happy to have you here.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Wow. Okay. Well, first of all, if anybody would like to invite me in the future, I'm more than happy to come back. Just to cut to the chase. So first of all, thank you to the whole team here in this museum. It's true that we met in May for an event that I put together in San Francisco at the Fine Arts Museum. It's called Museums of Tomorrow Roundtable. And it's a week-long discussion where we bring 14 directors from 14 different countries to San Francisco, and we specifically focus on technology. So it's a leadership program. It's really about people who run institutions learning from each other, but with a special focus on technology. So we had wonderful opportunities to visit Google and Anthropic and speak directly to the sector. But that program, which was originated by Tom Campbell, who runs the San Francisco Museum, he used to run the Metropolitan Museum, which is how we first met, because many years ago, I don't know, 12, 13 years ago, Tom hired me at the Met. I was already working as a consultant. I do strategy in the cultural sector. That's my company. And we didn't have such a nice website back then. And Tom hired me because he was thinking about the Metropolitan Museum and how it's global. And at the time, the British Museum was advertising its sort of global credentials. And Tom was a little bit upset. He said, we have 16 departments, 16 regions of the world. What is our global strategy? So I spent a year going around. It was a dream job. I had to write a white paper, as it was called. And I spent a year at the Met, embedded in the institution, meeting with every head of every department to think about their role in the global scene. And part of the job was to invent a new program that would sort of spotlight the international connections of the Met. So we decided, let's do a leadership program for museum directors, because guess what? Nobody studies to be a museum director. Everybody learns on the job. Most people are coming out, in some parts of the world, coming from government. Sometimes they're coming from curation, and then they get put upstairs to run the institution, but that doesn't mean you know how to run an institution. So we decided to create a program, and in that program we did have people from Mexico, Agustin Arteaga, who Sia helped us with as well. So these lines connect back, and maybe I should say a few more words, not to be egomaniac, but to say a few words about myself, just to fill in the blanks, like why is this guy here and why is he doing what he's doing. So I was born in Budapest. I left to the United States when I was 24 to do a doctorate in sociology at Columbia University. And when I got to New York, it was the late 80s, very early 90s. And those of you who've been paying attention know that the 1980s was a huge boom in the art world. In many ways, that was the time when the art world kind of became a kind of cultural industry. And the art market was booming. We have art dealers here in the room who know this, although they were a little young for it at the time. And so I was always found my way to art through the back door. In Hungary, I was the translator of all the art historians into English. I was bilingual because as a child I lived in England. So I learned through osmosis. And when I finally was in New York, I said, I can study the art world. I don't have to be a, serious sociologist. So I decided to write about the art world and how it changed into this big industry in the 80s, and specifically about galleries, because art historian, how many art historians here? Okay, well, so no offense, but art historians don't write about the material underpinnings of the art world. So art dealers and art galleries were really marginal to the history of art. So I thought, okay, let's study art dealers. So I wrote a dissertation about 3 New York galleries going through this period. And then as I moved on, I ended up running an institute at Columbia that was around cultural writing and cultural journalism. And then I was training people at the Sotheby's Institute of Art going into the art world. But really the turning point, and I began advising cultural institutions on strategy. My very first job was for the Andy Warhol Foundation. They wanted to create an art writing program, and I thought, this is really cool. Like, it was almost like being an architect to design new programs, new initiatives for cultural institutions. It's also the kind of job that I had to invent a little bit, and I sort of grew with it. But for me, and for this book series, the turning point, as in so often the case, was the pandemic. Because by the time the pandemic came along, I had run 4 versions of this Metropolitan program. I knew a lot of museum directors. Some of my best friends are museum directors. And when we were closed down, you were all shut down here as well, right? So very early, it was Easter weekend, Easter. So really just a few weeks into this, I wrote an article in ArtNet News. And I said, you know, if a supermarket can be open, we can find a way to open museums, which at the time was kind of a very daring thing to say. And I said, you know, if we do some rules about how we would manage the crowds, and maybe we have, you know, one person at a time, because after all, even in the Blitz in the 1940s in London, during the Blitz, the National Gallery was open. Now, it was only one artwork. You could go in from Trafalgar Square. They would only put up one artwork. But during the Blitz, they kept the museum open. So, and I thought, you know, for a lot of people, the museum is really important. So anyway, I wrote this article. There was a lot of interest. It was being read everywhere. At the time, everybody was reading. There was nothing else to do. And a lot of my museum director friends said, you know, they wanted to talk about this. And I thought, okay, this is my opportunity to do a book which I always wanted to do, which is a book of conversations about museum with museum directors. And because they were all at home, so they were not traveling, it was actually very easy to do. And many of them were sitting in their kitchens or in their bedrooms. And so basically I signed a contract in May, and in September I delivered the book. So in 6 months I wrote this book called The Future of the Museum, where I talked with 28 museum directors thinking about the future of the museum. And as you can imagine, when this book appeared in November of 2020, with the word future in the title, everybody was super interested, like, wow. But I was actually very lucky with the timing because as you know, the fact that you're sitting here means you know this. This is really a turning point for museums. There was already a long process of museums opening up, becoming more democratic. But in the circumstances of the pandemic, I think there was really deep thinking going on in museums about how we're going to make the museum more open, more accessible, more democratic, more inclusive. If I may use this word here in Mexico, I'm maybe allowed to use this word, which is now forbidden north of the border. So in a way, these conversations became kind of a book about the new museology. And because it was conversations, not the usual gobbledygook that you often find in sort of academic writing about museums, people actually read this book. So it became very popular. So then everybody said, okay, you need to do another book. So then I thought, okay, well, what should the second book be? And so I thought, well, if the first book essentially, as you mentioned, was about the new software of the museum, this sort of new idea of the museum, where surely if there's new software, there has to be new hardware. In other words, the museum building has to change. And I was always very interested in architecture. I wanted to be an architect. I actually wrote a lot about architecture here and there. So I thought, okay, let's do a book about museum architecture. So in 2022, I did the same thing all over again, but this time with architects. And I spoke with 21 architects. And along the way, I discovered that it's more interesting to speak with the younger generation of architects instead of the usual suspects, because I could have just done, Gary, Ando, blah, blah, blah. But I was interested in the next generation, the people who are actually, to some extent, pushing beyond the great architects, the Jean Nouvelles and the Frank Gehry's. So Frida Escobedo is in my book, and Kulapati Antrasast, who's now building all the museums, they're in the book. So this book also became widely read. So that was 2022, 2 books down. And then, of course, if you're going to do 2 books in a series, then you have to do 3, right? Because good things come in threes. So everybody's like, okay, you need a trilogy, so you have to complete the trilogy. And so then I kind of decided to go back to my roots. I'd written my dissertation on the art one, and I thought, well, if we started with the software, and if we moved to the hardware, well, what's next? It's the ecosystem. It's the art world around this. And because in the end, these books are really for leaders or people who work in museums to navigate the future. So you need to know what's the mission. You need to know what's the physical museum. And by the way, I congratulate the team here, because this is a beautiful museum. This is really like a beautiful museum. But then you also need to know the social, cultural, economic, technological, institutional, organizational framework around the museum. And that's the art world. And one more point, which is you'll see in this book, it's dedicated to very famous philosopher and art critic, Arthur Danto. Maybe some of you who have studied these kinds of things have read him. He was the chairman of the philosophy department at Columbia, but also maybe the top art critic of the time. And when I was doing my dissertation, there was nobody in the sociology department who could be my advisor. So I went over to the philosophy department and I knocked on the door of Arthur Danto, and he became my advisor. And in fact, he became sort of my mentor, and one of my kids is named after him, and he married my wife and me. Like, it's a very deep story. And now I've dedicated this book to him. But he conceptualized this term, art world. So in a few minutes, I will read 2 short passages, but one will mention Arthur. Okay, so a few more things about the book. So you're going to do a book about the art world. That became a very different challenge than the first 2 books, because in the first 2 books, I talked with the same type of person, 28 museum directors, 21 architects. So in a way, the conversations were similar. I could follow a similar line of questioning. But now I decided I need to talk to all the other characters in the art world. I need to talk to the artists, the curators, the collectors, the patrons, the politicians who are moving parts of the Middle East towards museums. I needed to talk to philosophers and sociologists and historians and marketing people. And I needed to talk to people in the art business. So I need to talk to art fair people and gallerists and auctioneers. And I wanted to do all this on a global basis. So that's why this book is the longest, because I was allowed to do up to 40. So I ended up doing 38. So you have people in all of these categories, but it also meant that every conversation is very different, because it's a different conversation with, let's say, Marc Spiegler, who ran Art Basel, than with a French philosopher who studies the intersection of cognition and museums. Oh, is this for me?
Of course.
Thank you very much. The service here is amazing. So 5 stars on Yelp for you. Thank you. And of course, along the way, we also became very involved in technology. So it was, by the way, a terrible business trying to do the whole art world with 38 people. So as I write in the introduction, or somewhere in the book, I said, if you do a book like this, you will spend the rest of your life apologizing to all the people that you didn't interview. But so we started with a list of 400 people, and then we had to game out. Well, we need somebody in Japan. We need somebody in Latin America. We need some. So, but in the end, I think it provides a very interesting introduction to the field. But then, because now technology is very important, we had a final little trick, which is why this is flashing here. Because along the way, because of my work, we worked really with museums across all over the world. And these days, more we work with technology. So I got involved with a new company called Artless, which is a navigation app for museums. And it includes an AI called Meti, after Giacometti, is a cat. And this is an app for average visitors to the museum, and it tells you you can have a conversation with this app to help you guide you through the museum. But so since I knew these people, I said, can you help me? I want to create an app. I want to create an AI for my book. So this is the website of my company, and here, thank you very much. And here, this is, I don't know where, so this is just my company website here. These are various clients, blah, blah, blah. But I'm going to go on the book page. And so here's this book. Well, actually, maybe you should see. First of all, there's the two other books. So there's I don't know why this is doing that. Huh? How does this work? Does this work? Here. So here's the trilogy together. The three books together, okay? And then here's the new one. Let's go to that one. And as you could see, you could buy it. This is very important to all of you. This is how you can buy the book. It's actually not that easy. There are a few copies of the book here, and I'm told that they will order more books. And if you have bookshops or museums, you can order the book for your colleagues. But then we decided to do a little AI. So this is apparently the first ever art book to have its own AI. And by AI, I mean not that this AI is asking the internet, it's only using the 38 dialogues in this book. So what should we ask? Let's ask, what is the future of the art gallery? Some people might want to know. Okay, where's the question? You have your Spanish. Anyway, it will probably know that it's a question. So, okay. So now it's going to hopefully answer what is the future. Squeeze in the middle. So, Andres, would you agree mid-sized galleries have a hard time in this world? Possible futures, millennial challenge. Then you can ask maybe another question. Let's say, who specifically...
Give us
what's happening? Okay, sorry. Who specifically talked about is in the book. And then hopefully, there we go, Mark Spiegler. So there you go. So now it tells you what Mark said about the gallery. No, Horowitz, Atsuko Ninagawa, she's a dealer in Tokyo. Alan Serre is a collector. So it's a way of interacting with the book. It's a really fun game. It speaks Spanish, by the way, I'm told, on good authority. So that's that. And you can play with this. Just go on the website, have fun. And, it's one of the many ways we will start using AI. And, I thought you would find this interesting. Let's go back to just the cover page, maybe, because it's not so pretty. We can stay here. Okay. So far, so good. So I'll maybe say a few words more about the book, but just to say you know, in the first two books, they kind of, I never start with a thesis. I'm not the kind of person who says, okay, here's my idea, and now I will talk to these people just to prove my point. And what was very interesting in the first two books is that there was a theme that emerged in the first book, which was this idea of this more open and inclusive museum. And even I was surprised, because when I finished the interviews, I had to write my introduction, and I reread all the interviews. I was like, wow, there's really something going on in the museum field. So that happened with the first book. Second book, Architect, same thing. I did the interviews, and then I reread all of them, and then I said, wow, there's a different attitude to museum architecture than a generation ago. I didn't have that epiphany with this book, because I described this book as a stained glass window. It's just all these different perspectives. But as you will see, instead of trying to say, okay, here's the big idea about the future, I ended up writing about a spectrum of possibilities about the future. So would it be okay if I read a few short things? Okay. So I'm going to read two mercifully short passages. And don't worry, I'm a very accessible writer. I'm not going to put you to sleep. But I thought I'll read one section which is about what is the art world, because that's also where I mention Arthur. And then I'll read another section after that. And I've never done this before, and I should say once again, Miguel, this is actually the first public launch of this book, so why not read a little bit? By the way, have you all read the book Gattopardo, the famous novel? Yeah. So my motto for this introduction comes from Lampedusa's Gattopardo. The quote was, "If we want things to stay as they are, things will have to change." That's the... It's true, isn't it? To the art world. My younger son Hugo was 6 when he asked me as I was heading to the airport to attend Art Basel, "Daddy, are you going to the art world?" I was delighted that a child could imagine. Sorry, I'm going to have to put my glasses on. Sorry. Okay, and this child now is 14, by the way. That the child could imagine the art world as some kind of a country or state with its own borders, people, and landscape. In a way, he was not wrong. I've been fascinated with the art world since the early 1990s, when I was a graduate student in sociology at Columbia University, and lucky enough to be working with Arthur C. Danto, the philosopher, professor, and art critic who coined the term art world, or art world, as he put it. His oft-cited definition, published in a 1964 essay, was prompted by an encounter with Andy Warhol's then just completed Brillo box sculptures. You're all familiar, I'm sure, with these sculptures. And he wrote, "To see something as art requires something the eye cannot decry, an atmosphere of artistic theory, a knowledge of the history of art and art world." This is maybe the most famous quote in aesthetics in the last half century. Danto not only advised my dissertation, he ushered me into the social circles of the art world, that enigmatic domain my son would imagine years later. For Danto, a philosopher, the art world was about ideas. For me, a sociologist, it is no less about real people and real institutions. In my 1996 thesis, I defined the art world as an amalgam of ideational and institutional constructs. Quote, "The notion of an art world can be understood abstractly as a field governed by a discourse of reasons about what is art, and more concretely as a sociological entity comprised of individuals working in the framework of organizations in order to make art happen." Unquote. A little clunky, I admit, but 3 decades later, I'm sticking to it. What do my interlocutors in this book understand the art world to be? Some definitions are intuitive. There's a lot of quote marks here. I'm not going to say the quote marks. Anybody who would rather spend a Saturday afternoon in the museum rather than in a shopping mall, or who has a professional, financial, or emotional engagement with visual art. As one artist who works with emerging technologies put it, quote, "The art world explores humanity's capacity for imagination." Others consider the art world more systematically, quote, a complex network with identifiable nodes, the artists, galleries, museums, collectors, curators, and so on. Or a global ecosystem in which, quote, artists, their galleries, museums, auction houses, art fairs, collectors, private advisors, dealers, flippers, art lovers, and selfie takers all coexist. Or a world in and of itself with its own people, its own institutions, and crucially, its own rules. A few of my respondents compared the art world to a living entity. It is, quote, a bunch of organs working together, said one. Another reminded that, quote, any ecology supposes that there are predators and the food chain, but there is also pollination, crossbreeding, and symbiosis at play. Anyway, just jumping ahead, what's not debatable is that the art world has mushroomed in terms of participants, prices, and global reach. In the 1970s, there were a handful of art fairs. By 2020, around 50. Today, some 300. The ArtNet price database currently lists some 300,000 artists, up from 71,000 in 1988. The high-end art market has downshifted from its torrid growth rate of recent years, but stoked by international mid-price and online sales, its turnover still hovers at around $60 billion annually. While that figure may sound modest in mainstream economic terms, and here I say, if the art market were a company, it would rank 160th in the US behind Delta Airlines. It's double the prior all-time peak achieved in the 80s boom. According to recent estimates, there are some 300 biennials and some 8,000 to 10,000 active art collectors worldwide. The number of museums of all kinds have grown fivefold since 1975 to more than 100,000, including 446, I'm happy to say, private museums of modern and contemporary art. In 2024, the world's top 100 art museums drew 200 million visitors. So anyway, it's a big place, or it's getting bigger, so you need more consultants. Okay. So that was sort of the backdrop, and then I talk a lot about why this is all changing. You have to buy the book to read that, but I thought I will jump sort of to the denouement of all this, which is, okay, so what does the future look like? Sorry. And this is going to be a tiny bit longer, but it's kind of more fun because it's about the future. It's more speculative. Okay. Is this okay?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Okay, so this section is called Spectrum of Expectations. So will the art world carry on by making steady, if small, changes, or is it due for a deeper realignment? I asked a version of that question in almost every conversation. My interlocutors' answers provide an inventory of conceivable futures. That is actually the title of my introduction. And so, yes, just to say, while most of the interviews were very different, there were a certain number of questions which I asked everybody. And one question was, what is the art world? And one question was, do you think that there will be a paradigm change, like a fundamental change in the structures of the art world? And I also asked most people if they felt, is this the right kind of art world for today's society? So anyway, so now here we go. So here comes various possible futures. So based on things I heard. So at one end, on one end is a scenario of what I call incremental adaptation, in which the art world adjusts to spiraling developments in society through a series of calibrated steps. This view sees the system as flexible enough to constantly upgrade. How does it play out? Galleries enter new regions and experiment with new formats. Art fairs platform more kinds of art, invite different dealers, offer new experiences. Museums attract bigger audiences, tap new revenue streams, add welcoming amenities. Through it all, the system maintains familiar patterns, rules, norms, hierarchies. At the opposite end of the spectrum is paradigm change, in which the legacy system is fundamentally retooled. This is what happened when the French Académie des Beaux-Arts surrendered its authority in the late 19th century. As sociologists Cynthia and Harrison White documented in their famous book, Canvases and Careers. Has anybody read this book? It's a great book about French art market in the 18th century. A vast number of artists were crowding into Paris by the 1860s and 70s, seeking fame and fortune. Avant-garde painters, unable to advance in the narrow and rigid system, allied with collectors, critics, and a new breed of independent dealers who offered them exhibitions and the path to professional mobility. Thus, the current paradigm was born. What could trigger a paradigm-shattering disruption today or tomorrow? The most likely culprit would be a new digital platform for exhibiting, validating, experiencing, and trading art, one that could undergird a more open art economy and usher in new forms of creative practice. However, there is scant indication in this book, in these dialogues, that such a discontinuous scenario will be encroaching anytime soon. Okay? What other futures then may lie in store? Here we must enter the realm of pure speculation. For some, the future may unfold in a fractured shift, whereby certain but not all parts of the system undergo paradigmatic change. One sociologist interviewed here proposes that the dominance of mega galleries and art fairs already constitutes a deep shock on the commercial side, which looks increasingly different not only in degree but in kind. The future, in other words, may arrive on a different schedule in different parts of the system. Another scenario, one that you will appreciate here, is that the art world system splinters into a global pastiche, rendering differences between regional scenes more pronounced. This would be the culmination of a decentering of art from the global north that began in the late 20th century. In this prognosis, institutions and markets in different parts of the world would demonstrate an ever deeper pluralistic variety. The next one is radical hybridity, where various entities combine to be more competitive or sustainable. This is yet another possibility. Although mergers in the art world remain exceedingly rare, we see indications of this in financially stressed galleries that are testing partnerships and consortia, and in museums that are launching acquisitions, data collections, and expertise-sharing partnerships, alliances. Seeking new efficiencies, seemingly incompatible parts of the art world could amalgamate into new alloys. Galleries collaborating with auctions. The major auction houses already conduct a brisk trade in private sales. Or, dare I say, art museums selling art. Some already do. Different creative fields could fuse in vibrant cross-disciplinary clusters, as they have at London's Barbican Centre, at Sao Paulo's Chez Pompeia Factory, and at the Palais de Lomé in Togo, places I'm sure you all have visited, to yield cultural, commercial, urbanistic, and environmental benefits. Could the future accelerate the formation of a great blend, causing the art world to be absorbed into luxury commerce and popular entertainment? The top art fairs, Art Basel and Frieze, are already controlled by firms that invest in destination leisure. Christie's auction house shares an owner with fashion brands Balenciaga and Yves Saint Laurent. Prada and Cartier have renowned art foundations and collections. Hauser and Wirth Gallery is expanding into hotels and restaurants. Museums are organizing shows on pop music, movies, couture, and sneakers. This convergence is not just monetary, it's about mastering the logic of branding. As an older generation of pioneering art dealers passes on, some of their younger colleagues are preparing to operate under their names in perpetuity, like the great Parisian fashion houses. Another foreseeable scenario would turn the art world into a kind of analog sanctuary. This would follow the evolutionary model of the luxury watch industry, which responded to the ubiquity of electronic timekeeping by upscaling to mechanical devices of breathtaking complexity. Might the art world pivot by more intentionally offering a refuge from the data feeds that dominate and distract from people's lives? Such a retreat, or more accurately, a strategic advance into realms where art world entities hold advantages in skill, reputation, and infrastructure, could result in a decoupling of physical and digital art networks, as I was just saying earlier at the other talk, Online art experiences, AI productions, and immersive entertainments could entrench distinct operating models, splitting the art world into parallel lanes. Don't worry, it's just a few more paragraphs. After a half-century of worshipping contemporary work, could the art world undergo another taste inversion? It's hard to overestimate how anomalous the neophilia that hit its stride in the late 20th century has been, compared to centuries of appreciation and higher prices for works from previous eras. A flip back in taste patterns would mark a revision to the mean. If this taste inversion arose, meaning if suddenly contemporary art wasn't more expensive than old art, it would demand a comprehensive rethink of the art world's current protocols. And finally, what if the art world, struggling to attract tomorrow's audiences, were to follow in the footsteps of symphonic music, ballet, and jazz, withdrawing into what I called an amber grotto of splendid obscurity? In this scenario, the legacy art world could become a sophisticated but culturally peripheral domain, supported by those who truly care about it or who can afford to stay involved, as bibliophiles and builders of wooden ships sustain their own passions. As established institutions recede, younger cohorts of creatives could flee to new ecosystems. Faced with this version of the future, museums may abandon their democratic impulses and turn inward. They would no longer seek success by opening up and expanding their audiences and focus instead on cultivating the few upon whom their survival relies. Okay, so those are some versions of the future. Sorry, the last one is a bit of a bummer, I understand. And you know, the trick here for me was to try and put forward, like, not so much, okay, this is what everybody says, here's the bottom line, but I thought it was actually more interesting to invent a kind of language to talk about the future. Like, my hope is that one day some student in a classroom will say, oh, the analog grotto, or I believe it's going to be parallel lanes, like, to sort of, because in order to talk about, we don't know what the future brings. I mean, look at our last 5 years, okay? Just think about our last 5 years. We have no idea what's going to happen, but we do need a kind of vocabulary to even have a conversation about that future brings, because it's, if we decide, let's say if Museo Calus decides that the future topography of the art world will be, I don't know, a paradigmatically realigned art world, or, you know, that's one set of conclusions for how you should act strategically. If you believe in this idea of the analog sanctuary, which I think is actually a very interesting possible future, then you will make different strategic decisions. But is because you need to figure out what to do, because when you're operating these very large organizations, there's so much at stake. There's so much money at stake. There's so many people's lives at stake. And ultimately, there's culture at stake. So I'm going to stop maybe here, yes, because that's enough blah, blah. But I'm happy to answer any questions or...
Yeah, we have a few minutes for questions. ¿Alguien tiene alguna pregunta?
András, I want to know, what do you think about the new Egyptian museum?
Wow, easy question. You know, it's funny, a friend of mine built the National Museum of China. Are we recording? We're not recording. So he was a German architect. He's actually my second book. And he told me that when he was working on the National Museum of China, which is on Tiananmen Square, right opposite the People's Hall, near the place where Chairman Mao is lying, he would get these phone calls from the Chinese clients. He's like, how big is the Metropolitan Museum? How big is the Louvre? You know, so it had to be just a little bit bigger, you know. Mm-hmm. So, you know, apparently this museum is now the world's largest museum.
Yes.
And obviously, it's a museum that should have built, some version of it should have been built a long time ago. And I think that the script here is the same as in Athens. So I think this is the first shoe to drop. So I think what's going to happen is like now we have the museum, so now we would like to have our things back. So I think it's going to be the beginning of a new push by the Egyptians to bring things back. So I haven't been to the museum, I can't judge it. To me, it sounds awfully big. I think some real great experts were involved. I'm sure it's a wonderful experience. But I think that it's part of a similar storyline of countries which we sometimes call source countries, which saw a lot of their cultural assets removed. And I don't need to tell you that, of course, Mexico and much of Latin America is in the same shoes. So the interesting twist to all of this, of course, is what really does then happen next. So one of the dialogues here is about restitution, and it's with a philosopher, Suleiman Dashir Diagne is his name. He spent a year at the Louvre as a resident philosopher thinking about return of cultural assets. And he's African, and he has a very, very interesting take on all of this, because a lot of these objects left, some of them under obvious, some of these objects just need to be returned, but a huge number of them are messy. And meanwhile, they've now spent 100 years in the West where, in his words, they have created their own roots. They've interacted with the culture around them. So it's a mess. And as we have now seen in Nigeria, where they built a museum for the return of the Benin bronzes, but now that the objects are moving, turns out that Nigeria will not accept them, it can become really complicated. But that's a very long answer to a short question. The bottom line is, the question is what happens next. Like now that they have this museum, will it be an opening of a new golden age of cooperation with global museums, or will it be some sort of a nationalist move, which unfortunately tends to be the pattern these days?
¿Alguien más? ¿Alguna pregunta?
Yes.
I was wondering how you did choose the 38 people you interviewed for the book, because maybe you would have interviewed 38 other people and you would have had different answers. And I'm asking also a bit regarding the idea of the global and regional specificities, as you mentioned in one of the like speculative futures.
Yeah. I mean, for sure, it's an impossible thing. You could do it. You could do 4 versions of the same book. You know, I have a team of people who work with me, so you know, I was listening to many voices. You know, to me, it's quite important to have more or less half women, half men, and it was very important to have this kind of global. So actually, to some extent, it's still too global north for my taste, but I have a lot of, like my own networks. I live in the United States. I'm very connected to Europe. But I think compared to many books like this, it's much more invested in a global point of view than you would normally find. So we do have really people from all around the world. For example, I also have an indigenous curator here who's focusing on indigeneity, which I think is a crucial issue. So, you know, of course, there's probably a dozen people in here who are just like people who I'm very close with. Like, I don't know, the artist William Kentridge is in this book talking about art and political power. And he's just a super close friend, and I wanted to do this with him. You know, Mark Spiegel and Noah Horowitz, I worked for many years at Art Basel, so I didn't interview somebody at Frieze, but I talked to them. So there was this category of sort of a core of people. And then a lot of people was research. Like I knew I needed somebody who could talk about what I think is a huge opportunity for museums. In a way, your show hints at this. I think one of the ways we are going to be important is through wellness and health and well-being and all of this. So I had to find somebody who studies this, and I found this French philosopher through the director of the MIT Museum, which is a client. So sometimes we really had to go looking for people to fill. Like I had a list of the topics. So if you go through the book, every chapter has a topic like art and well-being, or future of art fairs, or future of art in Africa. So sometimes I had to go find the right person. So I was very interested in the African continent, and I found this wonderful woman who I'd never met before, who runs an art fair in West Africa, and who could talk about the art fair, but more importantly, who could address the dynamics of the region. So it was really a complicated puzzle, and there were a few people that we started conversations with who we never finished, but it's an impossible task. But overall, we tried to sort of make sure that, ultimately, I wanted this book to be almost like an introduction to the art world. Like for somebody, I used to teach a class, Sotheby's Institute of Art, called Mapping the Art World. And I would have all these students who were very smart, but this is such a unique world. Like, people don't understand where it's coming from. It's not like you're going into finance. Like, everybody has some idea of what that is. So I think the idea was to kind of create this sort of panorama of topics. So if somebody actually reads from beginning to end, they would have a sense of like what's happening in the art. There was somebody.
¿Alguna otra?
Perfecto. Sorry, my answers are too long. I will make shorter answers.
Maybe this would be the same. I'm just wondering, what do you think about the cultural shift between entertaining as presenting art and reflecting on ideas?
Yes. So when you'll see that I think this is a huge problem for us as a field, which is we have to. It's a balancing act, because we want the museum to be popular, but we don't want to over-popularize the museum. We don't want a Disneyland museum. So we want to have. We want to be committed to rigorous scientific research and analysis, and we don't want to dilute the museum, but at the same time, we want young people, and we want people without high education degrees, and that's how we measure success, and at some level, that's a tension that we are all navigating. And there's a last remaining passage in this book, which you can read, where I address this very issue, that we are all on this journey to open up this museum, but we are coming out of hundreds of years where museums were an elite thing. Even the idea of what is art is sort of elite, because we say that there's this tiny little universe of things which is art, and everything else is not art. And then we have this institution where we keep these very special things, mainly for people who are specialists or who are highly educated and, part of this. And that's really how things were. So now how do we open this up? There's another part of the answer, though, which is in the wonderful conversation with the Brazilian curator Marcelo Dantas, who's a very, very clever guy. And it's a conversation on the subject of art and spectacle. Because I was very interested in this idea of art and spectacle, because we are living in a world now when audiences want the spectacle, right? The immersive experience. And he has this wonderful way of talking about it, because he says, look, spectacle, this immersive art, is really how we experienced art through most of our history. In the cave, we are dancing, we are smelling the smoke, we are hearing the music, we are moving, we are watching the shadows on the wall of the cave. It's actually an experiential, immersive artwork. In a cathedral, it's the organ music, the incense, the singing, the recitation of the poetry, essentially poetic texts, and there's a transfiguration through that immersive experience. And it was only in Dantas' view, when you had capitalism, that we said, well, we need to turn this into products, objects. So then we said, okay, we put a frame around the work. This is art. Everything else is not art. And we have these special objects. We put them in pedestals. We put them in a vitrine. That is art. So there's been, as he puts, a kind of domestication of art, like the way we domesticated animals from wild animals, and that today we are actually re-entering a time with these spectacles where we are unleashing art again, where people are rediscovering the joy of this totalizing experience. The only problem is that the art dealers don't know how to sell this stuff because it's not made into objects for sale. And actually museums are having a hard time with this as well. So long story short, that's also part of this history, that we are living in this moment when I think humanity is rediscovering this kind of highly experiential, immersive art, but the art world doesn't know where to fit that in. Yeah.